welcome to the deep dive. Today
Yeah.
we're diving into Ernst Mach's popular scientific lectures.
Popular scientific lectures.
Yeah, and don't let the title kind of throw you off.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually full of these really fascinating insights, even if like physics isn't really your thing.
What's remarkable about Mach is how he takes these really complex ideas
Yeah.
and makes them relevant to everyday life.
Right, like he's letting us in on these little secrets of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
He even uses like something as simple as a soap bubble
Yeah.
to illustrate this really profound concept about nature's drive for like efficiency.
He dives into this whole idea of minimal surfaces and how soap films naturally form the smallest possible area,
Okay.
but they still, enclose air. And it's not just about pretty bubbles.
All right.
Mach suggests this drive for efficiency, it's everywhere in nature.
And I love how he encourages people to like try this at home. He gives instructions for creating these minimal surfaces with like wire frames and soapy water.
Yeah.
It's like a 19th century DIY science project.
Exactly.
But he doesn't stop there.
No.
He uses this to challenge what we think we know about solids and liquids.
Exactly. He even talks about this scientist, Tresca, who showed that even seemingly rigid materials can flow like fluids under enough pressure.
Wow.
So like metals, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Mach uses this to show that our everyday categories of solid and liquid, they're more flexible than we think.
It's like he's saying, don't be so sure you know how things work.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a theme with him,
Mm-hmm.
like with how our ears work.
Yeah.
Okay, get this. He compares the inner ear to a piano.
Such a good analogy.
Bro.
He's talking about the research of this anatomist, Alfonso Corti, who discovered that the inner ear contains these tiny hair cells.
Okay.
And Mach compares them to piano strings, each tuned to vibrate at a specific frequency.
So just like a piano, creates sound through the vibration of its strings, our ears use these like tiny hair cells to detect and distinguish between different pitches.
Exactly.
It's mind-blowing.
It really is, and it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
Remember how he talked about soap films and minimal energy?
Yeah.
He connects that to hearing, too, with the concept of resonance.
You mean like how a tuning fork
Yeah.
can make another one vibrate without even touching it?
Exactly. Mach suggests that our ears might use a similar principle to pick out specific frequencies from all the noise around us, right?
Right.
So each hair cell is like a tiny tuning fork primed to resonate with a particular frequency.
Okay, that's seriously cool.
Yeah.
And he didn't just stop at sound. Mach actually found resonance in how we connect emotionally, too.
Oh,
He
yeah.
even compares the human heart to a tuning fork.
It's such a classic Mach thing to do,
Right.
taking these complex scientific concepts and making them so relatable.
Yeah, and we've all felt that sense of connection,
Mm-hmm.
like being in tune with someone.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also like subtly highlighting something really important about how our brains work.
Yeah.
I mean, how we're often totally unaware of all the processing that's going on behind the scenes.
Exactly. We hear a sound, we feel an emotion, but we don't often stop and think about the intricate mechanisms that make those experiences possible.
Right.
Mach is reminding us that there's this whole world of sensation and perception happening below our conscious awareness.
He uses that example of how we often don't realize something has changed until it's gone.
Yeah,
Like,
that's true.
like when you're looking for a book on your shelf and you recognize it instantly,
Yes,
even if it's just a sliver of the cover peeking out.
that's right.
You didn't even realize you'd registered those details.
It's like our brains are constantly gathering and processing information, even when we're not consciously paying attention. And that brings us to a really important point about Mach's view of scientific discovery.
You mean how he emphasizes the role of these like unconscious observations,
Yeah.
the ones we don't even realize we're making?
Yes. He argues that scientific breakthroughs, they aren't always about these sudden flashes of genius.
Right.
They're often the result of years, even centuries, of accumulated observations,
Wow.
both conscious and unconscious,
Ah.
that gradually build towards a new understanding.
He uses the example of Galileo and those famous falling objects.
Right. The story goes that Galileo dropped objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa
Right.
to prove that they fall at the same rate,
Yeah.
regardless of their weight.
Yeah.
But Mach points out that Galileo's insight, it wasn't some out-of-the-blue revelation.
He was built on centuries of observations about motion and gravity.
Exactly.
Wow.
Galileo was able to connect the dots,
Yeah.
but those dots were already there, scattered throughout history.
Hmm.
Mach says that science is a collective endeavor, this gradual accumulation of knowledge that builds upon itself over time.
It's like that saying, we stand on the shoulders of giants.
Mm-hmm.
Each discovery builds on the ones that came before.
Exactly. And sometimes those building blocks come from unexpected places. Mach talks about this other scientist, Christian Huygens,
Okay.
who made these major contributions to our understanding of motion.
Didn't he figure out something about pendulums?
Yes.
I vaguely remember that from physics class.
Huygens was, fascinated by pendulums. He was trying to solve this practical problem for sailors, right? How to determine longitude at sea.
Oh, right.
And in the process, he made this breakthrough in understanding how pendulums work.
Okay.
Specifically, this idea of a center of oscillation.
Okay, break that down for me. What is a center of oscillation?
So imagine a pendulum swinging back and forth, right?
Yeah.
The center oscillation is basically the point where all the pendulum's mass seems to be concentrated. It's like the sweet spot of the swing.
Okay, I kind of get it. But what does that have to do with longitude?
Well, Huygens realized that the period of a pendulum's swing, so the time it takes to go back and forth, depends on the length of the pendulum and the force of gravity.
Yep.
And since the force of gravity varies slightly depending on where you are on Earth.
He could use a pendulum to figure out his longitude. That's brilliant.
It is. But what Mach found really fascinating is that Huygens actually built on the work of Galileo. See, Galileo believed that perpetual motion was impossible. And Huygens took that seemingly simple idea and used it to understand the complex motion of a pendulum.
It's amazing how these ideas build on each other.
Yeah.
Often in surprising ways. And speaking of surprising, Mark doesn't just explore how we hear, but also how we see.
And just like with sound, he challenges us to really question our assumptions about something, we totally take for granted, vision.
He really throws you for a loop. Like with that example of ancient Egyptian art.
You mean how their paintings look flat to us? Yeah.
Without the perspective that we're so used to seeing.
Exactly. I always thought that was just like a stylistic choice.
That's what's so cool. Mach suggests it might not have been a stylistic choice, but a reflection of their actual visual experience. He points to this thing called binocular disparity.
Okay.
How each of our eyes actually sees the world from a slightly different angle.
Right, which is how we perceive depth.
Exactly.
But how does that relate to the Egyptians?
Well, Mach suggests that because the Egyptians lived in this world with wide open spaces and fewer vertical structures, they relied more on binocular vision, seeing things as they were, rather than developing this strong sense of linear perspective.
So their brains didn't need to create the illusion of depth the same way ours do.
Exactly.
So he's saying that their art wasn't wrong or less sophisticated, just different.
Totally.
Their brains processed visual information differently than ours. Exactly. And he points out that we actually learn perspective. Think about how kids draw, right?
Yeah.
They don't always get perspective right at first.
Right.
They might draw a table with one end much wider than the other because they haven't learned to interpret those visual cues as representing depth.
That makes total sense. We take it for granted, but our brains are constantly constructing this 3D world.
Yeah.
Out of the 2D images our eyes are sending. It's like our own internal virtual reality show.
Exactly. And Mach highlights how easily our brains can be tricked. He describes this experiment you can try yourself.
Okay.
You look at a folded sheet of paper with one eye.
Okay.
Depending on how you focus your eye, you can make it seem to flip back and forth between being elevated or depressed.
And the shadow shift too, right?
Yes. The light and shadows on the paper look totally different depending on how you're perceiving it.
Wow.
It shows how much our brains are filling in the blanks, right? Creating a cohesive image from incomplete information.
It's like our brains are always trying to make sense of the world.
Yes.
Even if it means bending the rules a little.
Exactly. And speaking of bending the rules, Mach points out that this whole idea of perspective is based on assumptions about how our eyes work.
Okay.
He uses this playful analogy. You know how you might get a compliment on your beautiful eyes?
Sure. Who doesn't love a good eye compliment?
Well, Mach says that what people should be complimenting you on are the little geometricians you have in your eyes.
Hmm.
He's referring to how our brains are constantly performing these like complex calculations
Wow.
to make sense of the visual world.
So it's not just about having pretty eyes.
Right.
It's about having smart eyes. Our eyes are like these incredible data-gathering machines
Yeah.
feeding information to our brains,
Yes.
which are then doing all this math to create this coherent picture of the world.
And he was really onto something.
Yeah.
And he didn't think these little geometricians, were limited to just vision.
Hmm.
He believed that this kind of like unconscious calculation was happening all the time,
Right.
influencing how we think and feel.
Right.
He even uses this like somewhat tongue-in-cheek example.
Okay.
He says, "You ladies are very interesting and difficult problems for the psychologists, but you are also extremely pretty phenomena of nature."
It's like he's saying there's a science to everything,
Yeah.
even human relationships.
Exactly. And while his, example might seem a little outdated now,
Yeah.
his point still stands. He's pushing us to see the connections between these like seemingly totally different things,
Yeah.
to look for the underlying principles that govern both like the physical world and our inner lives.
It's like we're like walking, talking puzzles.
Exactly. And Mach, he really believed that solving those puzzles, both inside and out,
Yeah.
is this ongoing process. He was really interested in how our understanding of the universe evolves over time.
Yeah.
And he really challenged this idea that scientific discoveries are all about individual genius.
Right. He talks about that with the principle of energy.
Yes.
This fundamental idea in physics.
Right.
We take it for granted now,
Yeah.
but it wasn't always so obvious.
Exactly. Take someone like J.R. Mayer, for example.
Okay.
He proposed this idea of energy conservation back in the mid-1800s.
Okay.
But the scientific community, they basically laughed him off.
Really? Why? Was his work that, out there?
It was radical for its time. People didn't understand energy as this thing that could transform but not disappear. It took decades.
Wow.
And contributions from scientists like Helmholtz and Joule to solidify the principle of energy.
So it wasn't this sudden, aha moment,
Right.
but this gradual process of building on each other's work.
Precisely. And Mach saw parallels between this evolution of scientific thought and Darwin's theory of evolution.
Whoa, that's a cool connection.
Yeah.
So he's saying that scientific ideas, like species, adapt and evolve over time.
Exactly. They respond to new observations, challenges, and sometimes they even go extinct if they can't keep up.
Right.
He uses the example of Black's theory of caloric,
Okay.
which explained heat as this fluid,
Right.
It worked for a while, but then new discoveries came along that it couldn't explain.
So it's like scientific ideas need to be fit
Yes.
for their time.
Exactly.
They have to be able to explain the evidence.
Yes. And Mach emphasizes that being a good scientist, it isn't about clinging to old ideas,
Right.
but being open to new ones. He's basically saying, don't be afraid to, throw out what you thought you knew if the evidence says otherwise.
That takes guts, especially back then. But it also shows how science is constantly, refining itself, getting closer and closer to this, my accurate understanding of how things actually work.
Exactly. And Mach argues that part of that refinement involves recognizing our own biases. He points out this very human tendency to anthropomorphize nature, to see, human-like intentions and motivations in the natural world.
Oh, right. Like how ancient cultures saw gods and spirits controlling the weather.
Yes. Or even today, how we talk about Mother Nature or say that nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Right.
Mach suggests that even our scientific language, using terms like, forces and laws and principles, can subtly reinforce this idea that nature has a mind of its own.
That's so interesting. We don't even realize how much our language shapes how we think about the world.
Exactly. And Mach, he encourages us to be mindful of that, to strive for, objectivity in science while acknowledging that we're still human.
Right.
We bring our own experiences and ways of thinking to everything we do.
Yeah.
Even when we're trying to be, purely analytical.
Right. It's that classic, observer and observed problem.
Yeah.
We can't separate ourselves from our own perception.
Precisely. And that awareness of our own limitations, it's so essential for any kind of meaningful inquiry. And you know how Mach is all about economy,
Right.
that drive for simplicity and efficiency,
Yeah.
well, he applies that to science, too.
Right. Like Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the best.
Exactly. Mach believed that scientific language should be clear, concise,
Yeah.
avoid unnecessary jargon. He even envisioned a future where this, like, universal language could help scientists from different cultures and fields understand each other better.
That's a pretty bold vision.
It is,
Uh,
but it highlights how much Mach valued, like, clear communication
right.
and recognized the power of language to both reflect and shape our understanding of the world.
This deep dive into Ernst Mach's work has been anything but popular
Right.
in the sense of being like watered down or anything.
He tackled some seriously big questions about, like, the nature of knowledge, perception, how we make sense of the universe.
It's amazing how relevant his ideas still are today.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are over a century later,
I know.
still grappling with these questions about how our brains work,
Right.
how scientific knowledge evolves,
Mm.
how we can ever truly be, objective observers.
And perhaps, like, the most important takeaway from Mach is that the pursuit of knowledge,
Yeah.
it's this never-ending journey.
Right.
It's about constantly questioning, challenging our assumptions, being open to new perspectives.
Yeah.
Who knows what incredible insights await if we
yeah.
can just keep our minds open,
Yeah.
our curiosity alive.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
So the next time you see a soap bubble or hear this resonant chord or marvel at this work of art, just remember Ernst Mach.
Yeah.
And his,
Yeah.
his timeless invitation to dive deeper,
Yes.
question everything,
Mm-hmm.
and never stop exploring the wonders of the world around us.